the range of positions. I want them to know that there's important people holding all these positions. Then I want them to make an informed decision. To me, that's the way I teach at university. And, I'll give you an example. When it comes to the teaching of evolution, I want the scientists in the major universities, and I think the vast majority do, to simply teach the science. But as Eugenie points out, if they're bringing in the metaphysics or a certain philosophy and collapsing them together, I have no trouble with professors saying that to their students, but not to say that this is evolutionary theory. Let me give you an example from my class. I had this absolutely delightful young woman. My first 3 weeks of the class is, here are what the terms mean. And I teach in a Catholic school within a public university, the University of Alberta. So I have a range of students. She raises her hand and she says, well, before I start off, I want you to tell you that I don't believe any of this Jesus stuff. I said to her, that isn't a problem. You're within a university. I will defend you to make those statements and defend the case. And she said, I'm a double major. I'm in paleontology and honors evolutionary biology. I am an atheist, and now that I've been introduced to these different categories to suggest there are different forms of evolution, I'm aghast at how a few of my professors come into science class, teach evolutionary biology, and overlay it with Richard Dawkins's form of atheism. Mm-hmm. And she says, what they're doing is they're baptizing evolutionary science with atheism. And you could have heard a pin drop because all the religious kids in the class going, yeah, this does occur. So effectively, and I think Eugenie and I get along so, in terms of our categories of the discussion, let them teach the science. I have no trouble with the professor saying, this is what I believe, but do not, and I'll use the technical term, do not conflate or collapse evolutionary theory with a certain atheistic, secular, or agnostic worldview, and at the same time, don't conflate it with my Christianity as well. Separate the science from the religious beliefs.
Yeah, the thing is, the nice thing about science is that it's really an equal opportunity substratum for all kinds of philosophical ideas.
Yes, ma'am.
Now, you can, somebody like me or like Richard Dawkins will look at the evidence from science and say, we believe that this supports a conclusion of materialism, that there's only matter and energy operating in the universe. Somebody like my friend Denis or like Dr. Collins would look at the evidence of science and evolution and say, that supports his idea or their idea that there is an intelligence in the universe, that there is a creator God, that there is meaning and purpose, etc. My only argument is that neither side should say that science compels either of those conclusions.
Yes.
Because I think that's doing damage to what science is all about. And to me, it's just sloppy philosophy of science. Yep. Because like Francisco was saying, science is a way of explaining the natural world, and we restrict ourselves to natural causes in explaining the natural world. Not because we're all a bunch of atheists, because we aren't. Some of us are, not everybody is. But because we don't have a theometer, all right? We don't have a way of controlling for or holding constant any sort of actions of God. Whatever experiment you set up, if you try to use God as part of that explanation, you're not going to get anywhere because any result of that experiment is compatible with God's actions. So, lacking the theometer, we just have to leave God out. And to say nothing of God is not to say that God is nothing, as Robert Conant says.
Exactly. If I add, Eugenie and I can go in the lab, we could come out with the identical scientific results. Mm-hmm. But then when we go to faculty club and start saying, what are the religious or philosophical implications, that becomes a completely different discussion. We'd end up at different conclusions, but the science is inert in that regard.
Would that it be? Francisco?
Well, I think they are correct. I certainly agree with everything that either one of them has said, almost word by word. But however, there is possibly a positive relationship between science and religion. Religion, faith, can be a motivating force to study the natural world and trying to understand the world as the creation of God. And for a scientist who studies the beauty of the natural world, it can be a source of religious inspiration. So the two fields of knowledge, of human activity, I think can interact positively in the sense explained. The problem arises when we enter into the notions, the concepts, in the way of explaining and accounting for things, because, again, saying it once more, science deals with natural causes, with what happens in the natural world, what explains the natural world. Religion deals with meaning, purpose, our relationship with God and with each other. They're completely different subjects. So there can be a positive feedback of sorts, but neither science explains religion, nor religion explains science, and it's better to keep them aside in that sense.
Well, you were president of the Society for the Study of Evolution. How do you study evolution?
I was a professor at the University of California in Davis. Interestingly enough, it was while I was president of the Society for the Study of Evolution that the state of Arkansas passed the famous or infamous law, statute as it was called, which required to teach creation science whenever evolution was being taught. Now, nobody had heard of creation science before. The statute itself, the legal law that was passed in the last day of the legislature in the state of Arkansas with 15 minutes discussion, defined what creation science, and there were 6 statements taken from the Bible, as if the Bible were a textbook of biology or of astronomy. So anyway, that statute was passed, and as a consequence of being the president of Evolution, I was the first contacted by the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, to try to plan a strategy as to how to deal with this statute. And eventually, as you probably know, it was challenged in the courts. Another thing that was going on at that time, I was also already a member of the National Academy of Sciences, and there was a new president of the Academy, and I went to him to tell him, this is a matter in which the Academy of Science should pronounce itself. And Frank Press, who had been science advisor to President Carter, was then the president of the Academy, and he told me, I think for dialectical purposes, he said, well, why should the Academy get involved in a particular field of science? And I told him, I do remember almost exactly the words I said, this is not about a particular field of science. This is about the survival of rationality in this country. If we require that something which is not science be taught as science in the schools, then it's a big step backwards. So I was one of the experts witnessing the trial in late in 81, and as you may know, and just to remind those of you who know and to tell those who do not know, we expected the state of Arkansas to appeal the decision against the state of Arkansas. The state of Arkansas decided not to appeal, much to the disappointment of the Society for the Study of Evolution, the Academy, the ACLU. Fortunately, in a way, the state of Louisiana had passed a statute which was exactly the same, word by word by word, and the judge in the federal court in Louisiana decided he was not going to hold the trial because it was identical statute as the one in Arkansas has already been declared unconstitutional. But the state of Louisiana appealed, and that went all the way to the Supreme Court and was decided as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court.
And this went on to the intelligence design in the Dover case. And I want to ask you, we know how that case came out too, at the same side. Nevertheless, critics will say, what is your problem with teaching competing ideas? You have your ideas, they have their ideas. Teach them both, let the students decide.
Absolutely. Nothing wrong with teaching competing ideas. But we're talking about what do you teach in a high school science class? And that's the big distinction. In a high school science class, you teach the consensus view of science or history or mathematics or whatever. You don't teach opinions, right? You don't teach that either the earth revolves around the sun or the sun evolves around the earth and let the students decide. You present the consensus view of science. Heliocentrism is here to stay. Trust me on this one. In biology, living things had common ancestors. That's the consensus view of science. It is not the consensus view of science that either evolution happened or everything was created as we see it in its present form, which is the special creationist point of view. Now, if the intelligent design proponents or the old creation